Stay classy, Golden Eagles. So you're going to need the Google Doc that accompanies this lesson that is titled Excerpts from Flight by Robert Burleigh. And I may be mispronouncing his last name. I'm doing my best on that. So you're going to need that. The first part of the excerpt, an excerpt is just a small portion from a book or an article or something like that. It's just a condensed version, just like a copy and paste type of a thing. The first part I'm going to read to you guys out loud, and what our focus is going to be on today, ladies and gentlemen, is our focus is going to be on finding key important details. Now, we obviously know that Charles Lindbergh was the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. That's one of the main points of our book, or probably is the most important part of our book, Flight. Okay, so what we are going to focus on today, and you guys talked a lot about that in your little bit of parts that you did yesterday in summarizing like 2 to 3 pages. What we're going to focus on now is not saying what's the most important thing, but we're going to pull out key details from a particular part. So I'm going to model it with the first one, and then you're going to do it with the second one, okay? So since we don't have our student response books to underline, some of you may have them now, others may not. I did provide that excerpt. So the first one we're going to do together as a class, or I'm going to model for you. And the second one is what you guys are going to do. So you're going to use the Google Doc, and I'm going to have you guys either change the color or bold particular parts. I did both, okay? So make sure you have that up. And I'm going to read just directly off my computer, so it may look like I'm looking a little bit different, okay? So, excerpt from Flight by Robert Burleigh. It is 1927 and his name is Charles Lindbergh. Later they will call him the Lone Eagle. Later they will call him Lucky Lindy. But not now. Now it is May 20th, 1927. He is standing in the still dark dawn. He watches the rain drizzle down on the airfield and on his small airplane. The airplane has a name painted on the side, Spirit of St. Louis. Lindbergh is nearly as tall as the plane himself, and yet he is about to attempt what no one has done before, to fly without a stop from New York to Paris, France, over 3,600 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, alone. Okay, so in previous lessons this week, we've established that the most important idea of this story is that Charles Lindbergh, a pilot, is going to fly solo from New York to Paris, France, across the Atlantic Ocean, be the first person to ever do it. Now, what our focus is today is what are some key details that make that story pop even more, that are kind of important to think about. Like when we've done our research for our explorers, what were some of the things that we talked about? Well, we talked about what did they explore, what their early lives were like, what did they name after themselves, and things like that. So we're looking for those type of things. So if you have your Google Doc open, that's titled Excerpts from Flight by Robert Burleigh, you'll notice in that the top page that I have, 4 things in red and bold, okay? And those were the 4 things that I thought were most important. Now, when you guys do it, you may only think 1 or 2. You maybe find 5 or 6, but it's really important, guys, not to do too many of them, okay? Only pick the most important details that support this idea that he's crossing the Atlantic Ocean as the first person ever to do it on a solo airplane. Okay, so I'm kind of a details person I like to know names and I like to know years. Not so much knowing that like it's May 20th, but I do think it's important to know that it's 1927, and that was the first one that I bolded and changed to the color red. The next one is the person's name, Charles Lindbergh. Okay, just kind of like a refresher, be like, okay, we got to remember what his name, he was really famous, right? The other one I wanted to know was the name of his plane. I thought that was a really interesting thing to know. The Spirit of St. Louis is what he named his plane. Initially, almost all planes were named. Now, today, you know, it's a Boeing 737, but there's 10,000 Boeing 737s, all right? And the last one is what I think is the most important thing. We know about this flight. We know that it takes a very long time, over 50 hours. But what we maybe not know is exactly how long in terms of distance this is. And it's 3,600 miles away. So those were the 4 things that I highlighted as the most important thing from my excerpt that I did. The year 1927, our pilot, Charles Lindbergh, the name of the airplane, Spirit of St. Louis, and that it's over 3,600 miles away from New York to Paris, France. All right, so there's going to be a second video. The next video will be where I read to you guys, and then you guys are going to go through and bold and highlight or underline or whatever the case may be, show some distinction about what you think is the most important details to support the idea that this book, Flight, is about Charles Lindbergh and his crossing of the Atlantic Ocean solo. Stay classy, Golden Eagles.